Sometime around 1910 or 1911, according to Ellen White's youngest granddaughter, Ellen White was approached by an evangelical publishing house. They wanted her to prepare a book manuscript just for them. Now, when the first edition of Steps to Christ was printed in 1892, it was printed by an evangelical publisher, Fleming H. Revell. And according, as near as we can tell from our records at the White estate, to try to figure out when this story happened that Ellen White's youngest granddaughter remembered, it was probably the same company, Fleming H. Revell. Whoever it was, they had arranged to come to Elms Haven, Ellen White's home in Northern California. And of course, if they're going to get an author, any author, if you're going to get an author to publish or to produce a book so that you can publish it exclusively, why, there has to be a signed legal contract. And so they came to Ellen White's home at Elms Haven. Up on the second floor, the east end of the second floor, she had built, after she bought the house, she had built a big, airy room with big windows, bright and cheery. That's where she did most of her writing, and that's where she met the representatives from this publishing company. So they came. She was seated, as Grace told me, she was seated, and they were in a semicircle with their chairs kind of facing hers, but in kind of a half circle. And they began to talk to her about this book that they wanted her to produce just for them so they could have the exclusive rights to publish it. And first one and after another one would talk about what they needed and what they wanted her to do, and how if they had the permission, if she did this and they gave her exclusive permission, they would promote the book heavily, and that would mean bigger sales. They knew it was expensive for Ellen White to bring out her books, and so it all seemed like it was the way to go. And when they got through with their presentation, they put the contract there in front of her, because she would have to sign a legal contract saying that she was going to do this and then give them exclusive rights to it. And she reached over to pick up her pen, and then she laid it back down. And they thought, well, Mrs. White's getting old. Maybe she doesn't understand what we need from her. And so they briefly went through their proposal a second time. Now, this time it was apparently not as detailed as the first presentation, but the second time she didn't even pick up her pen. She just changed the subject tactfully, started talking about something else. So her son, W.C. White, Willie White, took the men downstairs, seated them in the parlor. He came back upstairs and he found his mother still seated right where she'd been, same chair. And he knelt down next to her and he said, "Mother, you understand why these men are here?" "Yes." "You know they want you to produce a book for their publishing company?" "Yes." "Well, you know, if you're going to do that, you need to sign that contract they brought." He said, "In fact, I thought you were going to sign it. You picked up the pen and then you laid it back down. Why is that?" She said, "Willie, as I picked up that pen to sign that contract, I saw an angel standing behind the men gesturing. And I know I'm not to sign that contract. I don't know why, but I know I'm not to sign that contract." Well, Willie knew that if an angel had indicated to his mother not to sign the contract, those men could sit downstairs in the parlor for 6 months or a year, and they were not going to get a signature on the contract. So he went down and told them thank you for coming, but that his mother was not going to be producing the book for them. Now, what Ellen White did not understand then is very obvious today. Any Ellen White book can be published by any Adventist publishing house anywhere in the world. If she'd given exclusive rights to this non-Adventist publisher for that one book, we would have had to deal, as a church, we would have had to deal with that publishing house or its successor anytime we wanted to print that book. And God didn't want that. It just is one little reminder of how important Ellen White's books are to God, and therefore they should be that important also to us. When I was in college, or now we usually call it university, many years ago, I had the privilege of talking to several of Ellen White's grandchildren. And one of the questions that I asked, and it wasn't just grandchildren, I talked to other people too that remembered Ellen White. This was about 52 years after Ellen White had died. So there were still a number of people living in California where I grew up and went to school who remembered Ellen White, had personal recollections. And one question I asked over and over was, did you ever receive a message from Ellen White based on a vision? And they all told me no, except for Ellen White's oldest granddaughter, Ella White Robinson. And here's the story she told me. They were living in Australia. Ellen White had her home at Sunnyside, right near Avondale College. And Willie White, Ella's father, had his house. Their family was living across the road, up the road a little ways from Sunnyside. And the school was just getting started. And there really were not any hotels or motels. When people wanted to come and learn about the new schools, decide whether or not to send their children there, why, there was no place for them to stay. So they ended up staying in the homes of some of the faculty members, or according to Ella, the number one place people wanted to stay was Ellen White's house. Now that says a lot about Ellen White as a hostess, if you want to stay there. But in fact, she had so much company. In one letter, she says, I think I'm going to put a sign on the front of my house that says free lodging. I mean, everybody's coming, so why not just do it? Anyway, Ella said that if Ellen White's house was already full, then she said it seemed like people wanted to stay at our place. And of course, when you have company, what does that mean? A lot of extra work. I mean, there's extra laundry that has to be done, food that has to be prepared, even the kerosene lamps, all the chimneys have to have the smoke taken off of them. And Ella said that one of her jobs was scouring the great big kettles or the pots that they cooked in. They had a wood stove, and these things would get smoke on the bottom of them, and she'd have to take them out behind the house. They had a sand pile, and she had to scour off all the smoke. And she said she hated it, just hated it. And with all this company, she said her friends, her classmates, they had a little church school, she said they didn't have all that company. So they didn't have all that work. And she said, I got to thinking, this is really unfair. Now remember, she was a teenager at this time. She said, this really was unfair, and I was so unhappy. So she said, I began to pray to God that God would impress my grandmother, Ellen White, to tell my mother not to have me do so many chores. And because that's a fair prayer. I mean, maybe not fair, but it's not an unusual prayer for a teenager, I suppose, to ask. So this is what she's praying. And she said not long after she started praying this prayer, one day Grandma came across the road. Now what usually happened, she said, when her grandmother was not traveling, was home in the morning after breakfast at her house, then she would come across the road to her son's house, and they would all gather in the parlor for a short time, and they would all visit. And normally they kind of had it just kind of unknown feeling that when they got to a certain point in the conversation, then Ella and her younger sister Mabel would take the little twin brothers that they had, well, they were actually half brothers. Willie had remarried. By this time, Ella's mother had died, so these were half brothers. But they would take the little babies in the other room and play with them so that Grandma could visit some more with Papa and Mama before she went back to her own home to work for the day. So this morning, Ella said, Grandma was visiting, and everything seemed like it was that point when Mabel and I should take our twin brothers into the other room. And so we started to do that, and Grandma said, no. She said, I have a message for the family. Well, Ella said, I realized this was a different visit than what Grandma usually has. So she said her grandmother reached in her purse, or she called it a satchel. She reached in her satchel and brought out this manuscript, and she began to read. And the first part of it was counsel to Willie, to her son, Willie White. And Ella said, that was fine. Grandma wasn't talking to me, she was talking to my father. I've been showing you should do this and do that and the other thing. And then after a little bit, why, her grandmother started reading to May's stepmother, to Willie's wife. And Ella said, that's no problem, wasn't to me. But she kept reading. After a while, she said, grandmother started saying, now Ella, I have been shown, or I guess she didn't choose, I was been shown. She said, she started giving advice about what Ella should be doing. Her mother is so busy with all this company and everything that, Ella, you should help your mother more. You should help lift her burdens. And she said, I was sitting there, I was getting so angry. This seemed so unfair. I'd just been praying to God, impressed my mother not to ask me to do so many chores. And here's Grandma saying, I should do even more. And she said, as her grandmother kept reading about how important it is, no matter how little and insignificant something seems that we've been asked to do, we should do everything to the best of our ability. She said, I was so angry. She said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this, Jim, but I shouted out, I called out to my mother, or to my grandmother, did you just make that up, or did the angel really tell you all that? And she said, her grandmother said, I didn't put anything in here except what the angel has shown me. She said, I was so mad. Then she said, Grandma read a little bit more and had some advice from my younger sister, Mabel. But she said, I don't know anything about what that was about. I was so mad, I could just hardly wait for Grandma to get out of there. And she said, as soon as grandmother left to go back to her own home, she said, I ran to my bedroom and I began to sob. This was so unfair. And she said, I cried and I sobbed. This seemed so unfair. I've been praying to God to impress my mother to do less. And here Grandma says, God says, I'm supposed to be doing more. And she said, as I was there crying on my bed, she said, all of a sudden the thought came to me, that's the answer to your prayer. She said, it's not the answer I wanted, but it's the answer to my prayer. And I can still see this little, very short woman, very frail woman who was in her 80s when she was telling me this story. Her thin little finger pointing towards heaven as she said, the thought came to me that the great God of heaven had taken time from all that he does, running the universe, to send an angel down here to my grandmother to answer my prayer. Just a little teenager, answer my prayer. She said, I have been eternally grateful ever since, but I'm embarrassed to admit that was not my first reaction. She said, I dried my eyes. I remembered there was a big kettle out in that sand pit out behind the house. I went out there, she said, and I gave that kettle the best scrubbing I ever gave any pot or pan in my life. But it was a good lesson for me, because if you talked to Ella very long, you knew that she was thoroughly in love with her grandmother. She had nothing but warm memories of her grandmother. And yet when a message from God came that cut across what she wanted to do, what was her first reaction? It was anger, it was upset. It's not what I want to hear. None of us have the privilege of having known Ellen White. Everyone that knew her is now sleeping, waiting for the resurrection. And so we don't have that personal knowledge. And sometimes when we read things, we do find it hard. And sometimes we're tempted, or sometimes we do react in a negative way. But when, like Ella, finally it dawns on our minds, but these are messages that God sent. They are answers to our prayers. They will help us live a better life. It will help us in our walk towards the holy city. I think it helps keep everything in perspective. Some Adventists think that Ellen White was a very domineering, dogmatic type of individual, and that you wouldn't want to be around her. Well, let me just tell you one story about how she accomplished what she wanted, and it certainly was not a dogmatic way of going about it. If you have read Ellen White's health message, that's not her health message really, the message that God gave her for this church, you know that one thing she was shown is that we should have fresh air, lots of fresh air. Especially back in the days before there was air conditioning, you should have your windows open, get fresh air. Well, she was preaching on this particular occasion, the Sabbath morning, in Healdsburg, California. And it was in the spring, and everybody was afraid if they had any fresh air, if the windows were open, they would all catch a cold and they would die of pneumonia. So all the windows were closed. But now, of course, Ellen White believed in fresh air. She slept with her windows open in her own home, and so she gets up to preach. And the elderly lady that was there that day that told me this story said, Sister White said nothing about fresh air. She just began to preach. She said after a while, she stopped in her sermon, and she said, I wonder if the deacons would mind opening the windows on this side of the church. So the deacons got up and lifted all the windows and opened the windows on that side of the church. And she said, Sister White began to preach again. After a while, she paused again, And she said, I wonder if the deacons would mind opening the windows on this side of the church. So the deacons opened the windows on that side of the church. This elderly lady told me that by the time Sister White sat down, she had every door and every window in the Healdsburg church standing wide open, but she'd never mentioned fresh air even once. Oh, she said, we all got the point, but that's the way Ellen White did it. She didn't make a big issue out of it, just would the deacons open the windows, would the deacons open the doors? And this lady said, I checked around and nobody got a cold. And we all had fresh air that Sabbath. It was not easy being the Lord's messenger. Ellen White had no control over the messages that God gave her to deliver. And some of them were quite difficult, and she acknowledged this. In 1880, she wrote about a situation at the Vermont camp meeting. She said, I had some very bad jobs to perform. I took Brother Bean and wife and talked to them very plain. They did not rise up against it. I cried myself, could not help it. Let me share with you a story of one of those difficult assignments that God gave her. In fact, from my perspective, it's probably the most difficult that I've ever read about. She was on one occasion given a message for an individual. She did not, in the vision, she was not told his name. She did not see the person. She just heard a voice. And she was told that when she heard that voice, she was to deliver a message. She didn't recognize the voice. Now, often when God would give her a message for someone, she would know who the person was. And Ellen White was human. And if you've got a bad job to perform, as she just wrote about, why, you could think about it, and I'm going to meet this person, and what am I going to say, and that kind of thing. But she had no advance warning. She was heard a voice in this message and given a message. She didn't know who that person was. So she didn't know when she was going to see the person. Not too long afterwards, she and her husband, James, arrived at a camp meeting. They got settled, and they walked over to the main tent where a meeting was going on. She seated James in the tent, and then she proceeded to walk down the center aisle of that tent. Now, as near as I could tell from the way the story is set up, there were chairs on both sides. Sometimes chairs are in the middle and you have aisles on each side. Apparently this was, the way the seats were here was there was a center aisle. And she begins to make her way down that center aisle towards the voice that she had heard, and she knew she had to deliver the message. From years of experience, she knew that she had to do what she was told to do, and she had been told, when you hear the voice, deliver the message. Now, the story doesn't tell us this, but in my imagination, I can picture people there in that congregation as the sermon is being preached. There goes Sister White, whispering to each other, there goes Sister White. I wonder what's happening. Well, look, she's walking right down there towards where the preacher is. Well, back to the story as it's come down to us. She got right to the front of that whole tent, right below the pulpit, and she looked up at the man that was preaching, who stopped at this point, and she said, Brother, I have been shown that you have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. Now, how would you like to deliver a message like that to a preacher who's in the middle of a sermon in front of a full congregation? But that wasn't all. She went right on. She said, I have been shown that you have on this campground a woman that thinks she's your wife, and you have children here who call you father. But she said, I've also been shown that and she named another state in the United States, that you have a woman there that thinks she's your wife, and you have children there who call you father. You have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. Now, when you go to the seminary, they teach you to have some kind of a conclusion to your sermon. I don't know what kind, this man probably never went to a seminary, but he certainly would have had a conclusion. And this was not it. But obviously the sermon is concluded. He's through. He's out of there. He's off the platform. He's gone. And Ellen White is left to deal with this shocked congregation. Because here was this man living a double life. And this was back in the early days before there was communication, easy communication. He was gone doing evangelism much of the year, so he just conveniently had a family in this state, and he had another family in another state. And so here she is with this congregation. And I think as a human, since Ellen White was a human, and we often forget that, but she was a human being, I think she must have just sighed a prayer of gratitude to God when out in the congregation a man stood up and said, "I'm Elder so-and-so's brother, and everything that Sister White just said is true. Several years ago, my brother confided in me that he was living a double life, but he made me swear that I would not tell anyone. But what Sister White just said is true." Maybe that helps us understand what Ellen White wrote in 1874 to Elder J.N. Loughborough, a pioneer minister. "I have felt for years that if I could have my choice and please God as well, I would rather die than have a vision. For every vision places me under great responsibility to bear testimonies of reproof and of warning, which has ever been against my feelings, causing me affliction of soul that is inexpressible. Never have I coveted my position, and yet I dare not resist the Spirit of God and seek an easier position." It was not easy being the messenger of the Lord. Ellen White was called to be the Lord's messenger when she was 17, December of 1844. For the next 70 years, she tried to call people to the Bible. She was constantly uplifting the Bible, tried to urge people to read the Bible, and she also urged people to give their lives to Christ. When she was very young, there were not, at this point, there was nothing that was printed, or hardly anything that was printed, and there was hardly any way for people to know, unless they heard her speak, to know what her teachings were, what her beliefs were, etc. But one of the things that God did that was quite miraculous was to have her hold Bibles on various occasions. Now, many people have heard about the big Bible that we have at the White Estate, at the main office of the White Estate of the General Conference. It's a great big book. It belonged to her parents. And on one occasion when she was 17, so just a short time after God called her to be his messenger, she held that Bible out on her left hand for 30 minutes. It weighed about 18.5 pounds. She held some other Bibles. This one, this time, was closed. It was just out on her left hand, and she was talking and looking the other way. Obviously, if she wasn't in vision, there was no way she could, frail little girl like she was, could hold a Bible like that. On other occasions, she held smaller Bibles. Sometimes she held them open, sometimes closed, but sometimes open. And while she was looking the other way, she would turn and point to texts of Scripture. All of these were a reminder to those early believers, and as I say, in the early days before we had many writings, many things published by her. It was a way for God to point out the centrality of Scripture, and her whole ministry, as I've said, was uplifting Scripture and pointing people to Jesus. In fact, in her first little book, published in 1851, you can now find this in Early Writings because it's been reprinted in the book Early Writings, she closed her first little book by saying, "I recommend to you, dear reader, the Word of God as the rule of your faith and practice." That's the beginning of her ministry. Towards the end of her ministry, in 1909, she attended the last General Conference session that she actually was able to go to. In fact, there was one in 1913, but she was too old to go, so she didn't attend the 1913. So 1909 was the last one. She spoke several times to the delegates that had assembled in a tent. If you can imagine a General Conference session being held in a tent, but in a tent in Tacoma Park, Maryland. The last day she came to say a few words of farewell. She felt it probably would be the last time she would ever be able to stand in front of the delegates that had assembled from around the world to conduct the official business of the church. And as she spoke to them, she finished her few remarks, and then she turned around and began to walk back to her seat on the platform when she thought of one more thing. She turned around, came back to the pulpit, to the podium. She picked up the Bible that she had been using in her talk. And with trembling hands, the 82-year-old servant of the Lord held out the Bible to the delegates. And she said, "Brothers and sisters, I commend unto you this book." Those were the last words Ellen White spoke at a general conference session, commending once again, as she had throughout her entire career, the Word of God to this church. Just because you were related to Ellen White, it did not give you an inside track to heaven. It certainly did not mean you were perfect. Tragically, Ellen White, who was a twin, she and her twin sister Lizzie, or Elizabeth, but her nickname was Lizzie, they were the youngest of 8 children. Lizzie, as far as we can tell, had no interest in religion at all. So there's not some inside track to perfection or heaven. This, I should add about Lizzie, this troubled Ellen White no end, that her sister had no interest in religion. Well, just one illustration of a white family member, just so you can realize they're real people, and they were not always perfect. In the late 1860s, James White had some strokes, several strokes. And Ellen White, concerned about her husband's health, wanted to get him out of Battle Creek, Michigan, where all the pressure was, because that's where our institutions all were in those days. And so she took him up to Greenville, Michigan. And there for a couple of years, they had a house, they lived, they did farming, and just different kind of pressure. I mean, you still have to worry about crops, et cetera, but it's different than dealing with people and deadlines of publications and all that kind of thing. Well, while they were up there was no Adventist church school, so they enrolled their son, Willie White, in a public school. And for whatever reason, he did not like his teacher. So one night, according to his son, who told me this story, Elder Arthur White, many years later told this story on his father. One night, Willie and a classmate got into the schoolroom, came in through a window, got into the schoolroom after hours. And Willie wrote a poem on the blackboard. And here's what the poem said. "The devil flew east and west, north and south, and caught up Miss Jones in his mouth. But when he saw he had a fool, he dropped her here to teach our school." Now that may not be the way you picture the White family, but that's what Arthur White said his father wrote. Well, after writing this poem on the blackboard, the 2 kids get out of the school. The next morning when this teacher arrives, she is a bit better teacher than Willie gave her credit for, because she recognized his handwriting. So she knew who wrote it because she could recognize his handwriting. But there it was, she left it up there on the blackboard. So when the students came in, here was the poem. She, after they all got seated, she asked, would the young man or the young woman who wrote this please identify himself or herself? Now, many, many things have changed in the last 150 years, but some things have not. And this is one that has not. Total silence. Nobody fessed up. Nobody admitted to anything. So, since she recognized the handwriting, she went over to Willie's desk and she said, "Willie White, I recognize your handwriting. I know you wrote this. I want you to take it back. In other words, I want you to apologize for what you've said about me." Well, here's what Arthur White told me his father's response was. "I can't take it back." Now that's bad enough. He probably should have stopped right there, but he didn't. He said, "I can't take it back because my parents have taught me always to tell the truth." I said to Elder White, "What happened to your father after that?" He said, "You know, that part of the story has never come down. I don't know." But he said, "I know a little bit about Grandpa White." That would be James White. He said, "I know a little bit about Grandpa White's reputation. And my guess is that they had a session out by the woodpile. Today we would say he got a whipping." It's just another reminder. They were all real people. And Willie was no exception. James and Ellen were no exception. They obviously would, even though the story may not have included this part, they obviously also had a session with the teacher to talk about their young son. So yeah, they were real people. One thing that people remembered about Ellen White were her prayers. Not very many of her prayers were recorded. Occasionally when she was speaking, giving a sermon, and she would pray at the end of the sermon, the secretary would take down the prayer. But we do not have very many of her prayers actually recorded. But the people that remembered them, they were very moved by Ellen White's prayers. HMS Richards Sr., the founder of the Voice of Prophecy, was a young man in 1909. He was a teenager in 1909 when Ellen White came to Boulder, Colorado. It was her last trip across the United States, and so she stopped at Boulder, and they were having a meeting there. And he would recall that it was in a building, he thought it had 8 sides and had an iron roof. I think it was the Chautauqua building actually, but he doesn't call it that. Anyway, she spoke. And he said that when she spoke, of course this was without any microphone, so she's having to project her voice. He said that she could project her voice, everyone could hear her, and it began to rain on that iron roof. And you can imagine all the noise when the rain is coming down. He said she went into a real preaching voice and she just talked right above the rain. But when she got through, of course, she was quite tired, and her son stepped up to where his mother was still speaking and said, you know, I think maybe you've got a long trip yet. Maybe we should stop now. And she said, no, I want to pray for the people first. Now, Harold was 14 or 15 at the time, Harold Richards. He said he was seated on the front row. He'd come early, wanted to make certain he could hear Ellen White, be close to Ellen White. His father had met Ellen White, and he wanted to listen to her very well, intently. And he said when she knelt down by the pulpit to begin to pray, it wasn't our Father, it was my Father. And he said she began to talk as if she were having a conversation with God. He said he'd never heard a prayer like it. He said before long, out in the congregation, you could hear people beginning to weep and cry. She wasn't using any dramatics. She was just talking to God about this congregation. And he said that when she preached, he said it was like a grandmother, just an elderly grandmother giving a warm sermon. But he said when she prayed, God honored her, and many people's lives were changed during that prayer. He said he'd never, in fact, he recalled that as she was praying, he said, I was afraid to open my eyes. He said, I was certain that if I opened my eyes, I would see God right there next to her. It was that intimate as she poured out her heart on behalf of that congregation. He said as long as he lived, he would never forget that prayer that he heard as a teenager there in Boulder, Colorado. Being the Lord's messenger was not easy. For instance, you couldn't wake up in the morning and say to yourself, well, let's see, Lord, if you're thinking about giving me a vision today, I think about 2 this afternoon would be a good time. This morning I've got so much to do, you know, James, I've got to get him off to work, I've got to get the boys to school, and then I need to write some letters, and then of course I need to go visit some people. And if you're thinking today about giving me a vision, why don't you do it about 2 this afternoon? Didn't work that way. God chose when a vision would be given. Let me just give you one example of a time when I think if Ellen White had had her way, she would not have had the vision when she did. In March of 1858, James and Ellen White were traveling among the scattered little groups of Sabbath-keeping Adventists. And I say Sabbath-keeping Adventists because we didn't take the name Seventh-day Adventists till 1860. So we didn't even have a name yet. But there were several groups of Adventists in the state of Ohio, and they had traveled to various places. And on the weekend of March 13, 14, 1858, they had come to a little place called Lovett's Grove, Ohio. There was a schoolhouse. We had no church building there, so they were holding the meetings that weekend in the church house, or in the schoolhouse, excuse me. And everything was going fine, except on Sabbath, a little baby son of one of the members died. And so, because James White was there, they asked him if he would stay over and have the funeral on Sunday, which he agreed to do. So he had the service, and when he was through, Ellen White stood up and she began to offer a few words of condolence to that grieving family about their little baby boy that had died, that James had just had the service for, when all of a sudden she went into vision. Now, usually when Ellen White went into vision, she would call out, "Glory to God," sometimes repeating it 2 or 3 times. The record we have is that it sounded every time when she would say, "Glory to God, glory to God." She's physically right there, but it sounded like her voice was getting further and further away. Did that happen this time? We don't know, because there's no record specifically, but that would have been typical. She was in vision for 2 hours. Now, funerals in America are usually very somber occasions. It's not something you would normally want to interrupt. And I'm sure if she'd had her choice, she would not have chosen that venue for this particular vision. But what did God show her? Well, among other things, he showed her what we today call the Great Controversy. It was the Great Controversy vision. And if you stop to think about it from God's perspective, what better place to talk about what Satan has done, the results of sin, the impact of this rebellion that began in heaven, than at a funeral. I mean, right there is the best object lesson, this innocent little baby having just died the day before. Well, she was in vision for 2 hours, and when she came out, she shared a little bit about what she'd been shown. And others took the casket then to the graveyard to bury the little baby. And she and James then waited, I guess it was the next day, they went on towards Jackson, Michigan. They were headed back from Ohio, the state of Ohio, to Michigan, to eventually to Battle Creek, where they lived. As they were traveling on the train up to Jackson, Michigan, Ellen was describing to her husband a bit more about what God had shown her in the vision. As Dr. Roger Kuhn says in his book, he said, "I think on that train was an unseen, non-paying passenger." And that non-paying, unseen passenger was listening intently to what Ellen was describing to James as to what God had said about what this non-paying, unseen passenger had done ever since he rebelled in heaven. And when he heard that God had told Ellen everything, he determined that cannot be published. I cannot allow that to be published. Well, the Whites got to Jackson, Michigan. They were met there by some early believers. In fact, the earliest Sabbath-keeping Adventists in the state of Michigan, the Palmers, Dan and Abigail Palmer. And Ellen White then went to their home. They were going to spend a day or two and then travel on to Battle Creek on the train. And while she was there, she had a stroke of paralysis. She was only 31 years of age. They didn't think that she was going to live. They prayed for Ellen White, sent the word around, brought in several other Sabbath keepers to pray for Ellen White. She finally got enough strength so that she could get on the train. James could help her and they could make it back to Battle Creek. But she herself later wrote that she didn't think she'd ever see her boys again. She thought she was going to die from this stroke of paralysis. When she got home, she was so weak they put her to bed. She tells us that eventually she got to where she could write 1 page, and then she was too exhausted and she could not write anymore. Eventually she could write a page a day. She had to wait she said she waited 3 days before she could write the 2nd page. Then she got to where she could write a page a day and then several pages a day. And eventually she completed the manuscript for what we technically call Spiritual Gifts, Book 1. but it's really the first edition of The Great Controversy. After she had finished the manuscript, so a couple months later, after she had finished writing the manuscript for that first edition, but before it was actually printed, God gave her another vision and showed her that the stroke of paralysis that she had suffered in Jackson, Michigan, in the home of the Palmers, was Satan trying to kill her. That's why I say that unseen, non-paying passenger who was listening intently as Ellen was describing, determined he could not ever allow that book to be written. So when you and I read, because later Ellen White expanded The Great Controversy, eventually she does 5 whole volumes in what we today call the Conflict of the Ages series, Patriarchs and Prophets, Prophets and Kings, Desire of Ages, Acts of the Apostles, and The Great Controversy. But just remember that that series of books, especially the Great Controversy book, almost cost Ellen White her life. So just remember, Satan does not want us to read The Great Controversy. One time I was visiting with Ellen White's oldest granddaughter, Ella White Robinson. She had many memories of her grandmother. She was 33 when Ellen White died in 1915. So when I asked her the following question, she had a number of things she could choose from. I said, Ella, of all of your recollections of your grandmother, what is your absolute favorite memory? And here's what she told me. She said her grandmother was preaching one Sabbath. She was wearing a loose-fitting black sack dress. We've all seen pictures of Ellen White, so we can picture in our minds what Ella was describing. And she said as her grandmother was talking that Sabbath, she was talking about the matchless love of Jesus for each one of us. She said the congregation was listening. They were into the message that Ellen White was presenting. And she said right in the middle of her sermon, her grandmother stopped. She paused, stopped, and looked up as if she were looking into the very face of Jesus, and she said, "Oh, Jesus, how I love you, how I love you, how I love you." She said a hush came over the congregation. But she said, of all my memories of my grandmother, that is my absolutely most favorite memory. Ellen White was a good hostess. People liked to come to her house. In fact, they would often stay and stay. Why not? As I said, she was a good hostess. She had good food. She had a big garden. She had fruit trees. So people would come and stay. And meals were special times at Ellen White's home. Especially in the later years of her life, she had a cook because she was doing so many things and she had a big staff. So she had someone who would prepare the meals so that Ellen White didn't have to do the cooking herself. Now, there were some rules at Ellen White's house that made it very pleasant when you came together to eat. One rule was nothing unpleasant is to be brought to the table. Ellen White's view was you have all day to talk about your problems. If you're having a bad day, well, we could talk about it, but not at the meal table. So if you rule out any kind of negative conversation, you automatically have nice conversation during a meal. So that was one thing. Ellen White was happy to talk with you after the meal, but nothing unpleasant could be discussed at her table. Also, she had another rule that the grandchildren liked, and that was, I've summarized it this way: if you don't like it, pass it on. Everything was served family style. So the cook would bring in a bowl of potatoes or corn or beans or whatever, peas, whatever, and it would be passed around. And Ellen White had a rule: if you don't like something, Don't say, yuck, I don't want carrots today. Just pass it on. There's going to be more food coming. And as the granddaughter that was telling me about this rule said, this was Grace, said, there was good food at Grandma's house. So there was going to be plenty of food. If you don't want it, just pass it on. So no wonder people like to come and stay, because as I say, she was a good conversationalist, a good hostess. She had nothing but pleasant conversations at her table, and she always had good food. It was not easy being the Lord's messenger. Ellen White had no control over the messages that God gave her to deliver. And some of them were quite difficult, and she acknowledged this. In 1880, she wrote about a situation at the Vermont camp meeting. She said, I had some very bad jobs to perform. I took Brother Bean and wife and talked to them very plain. They did not rise up against it. I cried myself, could not help it. Let me share with you a story of one of those difficult assignments that God gave her. In fact, from my perspective, it's probably the most difficult that I've ever read about. She was on one occasion given a message for an individual. She did not, in the vision, she was not told his name. She did not see the person. She just heard a voice. And she was told that when she heard that voice, she was to deliver a message. She didn't recognize the voice. Now, often when God would give her a message for someone, she would know who the person was. And Ellen White was human. And if you've got a bad job to perform, as she just wrote about, why, you could think about it, and I'm going to meet this person, and what am I going to say, and that kind of thing. But she had no advance warning. She was heard a voice in this message and given a message. She didn't know who that person was. So she didn't know when she was going to see the person. Not too long afterwards, she and her husband, James, arrived at a camp meeting. They got settled, and they walked over to the main tent where a meeting was going on. She seated James in the tent, and then she proceeded to walk down the center aisle of that tent. Now, as near as I could tell from the way the story is set up, there were chairs on both sides. Sometimes chairs are in the middle and you have aisles on each side. Apparently this was, the way the seats were here was there was a center aisle. And she begins to make her way down that center aisle towards the voice that she had heard, and she knew she had to deliver the message. From years of experience, she knew that she had to do what she was told to do, and she had been told, when you hear the voice, deliver the message. Now, the story doesn't tell us this, but in my imagination, I can picture people there in that congregation as the sermon is being preached. There goes Sister White, whispering to each other, there goes Sister White. I wonder what's happening. Well, look, she's walking right down there towards where the preacher is. Well, back to the story as it's come down to us. She got right to the front of that whole tent, right below the pulpit, and she looked up at the man that was preaching, who stopped at this point, and she said, Brother, I have been shown that you have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. Now, how would you like to deliver a message like that to a preacher who's in the middle of a sermon in front of a full congregation? But that wasn't all. She went right on. She said, I have been shown that you have on this campground a woman that thinks she's your wife, and you have children here who call you father. But she said, I've also been shown that and she named another state in the United States, that you have a woman there that thinks she's your wife, and you have children there who call you father. You have no right standing in that pulpit preaching to this congregation. Now, when you go to the seminary, they teach you to have some kind of a conclusion to your sermon. I don't know what kind, this man probably never went to a seminary, but he certainly would have had a conclusion, and this was not it. But obviously the sermon is concluded. He's through. He's out of there. He's off the platform. He's gone. And Ellen White is left to deal with this shocked congregation. Because here was this man living a double life. And this was back in the early days before there was communication, easy communication. He was gone doing evangelism much of the year, so he just conveniently had a family in this state, and he had another family in another state, and so here she is with this congregation. And I think as a human, since Ellen White was a human, and we often forget that, but she was a human being, I think she must have just sighed a prayer of gratitude to God when out in the congregation a man stood up and said, "I'm Elder so-and-so's brother, and everything that Sister White just said is true. Several years ago, my brother confided in me that he was living a double life, but he made me swear that I would not tell anyone. But what Sister White just said is true." Maybe that helps us understand what Ellen White wrote in 1874 to Elder J.N. Loughborough, a pioneer minister. "I have felt for years that if I could have my choice and please God as well, I would rather die than have a vision. For every vision places me under great responsibility to bear testimonies of reproof and of warning, which has ever been against my feelings, causing me affliction of soul that is inexpressible. Never have I coveted my position, and yet I dare not resist the Spirit of God and seek an easier position." It was not easy being the messenger of the Lord.